We are continuing with the chapter on expansion and the Mexican War. We will be finishing up those, slides, starting with, I think, 15, which is the text, and then the maps with battle plans of the Mexican War. So we left off, Texas had its independence, but you have to remember who came to Texas. First of all, you had a lot of people who there was trouble in the air and they thought they'd show up and see what was going on. You also had people who moved to Texas primarily from Kentucky and Tennessee. If you look at the list of names of the Alamo defenders, if you're ever at the Alamo, they have them by state and they also have them by name. First of all, there's a good number of Hispanics who are also not very happy with Mexican rule. And the other thing is the two states where the most people died at the Alamo are Tennessee and Kentucky, both of which were slave states at the time. You also have a lot of settlers from the southern slave states moving straight west to come into Texas. There wasn't much law in Texas under Mexican rule. It was hundreds of miles from Mexico City. And until we became a state, and even until after the Civil War, there wasn't much legal authority anyplace in Texas. So it was pretty much up for grabs. As a result, all over the United States, if people disappeared and they had on their front door GTT, that meant gone to Texas, because it was well known you could pretty much get away with anything in Texas. The law wasn't going to find you. And if they were going to find you, they probably weren't going to bother bringing you back. So if you were in trouble with the law, if you had a bad marriage, if you were going to be jailed for debts, all kinds of issues, GTT was the common phrase and well known at the time. So Texas gets its independence and immediately applies for statehood. You'll notice there's a 10-year gap between these two wars. Texas, once she was independent from Mexico, applied for statehood, but the United States did not accept Texas as a new state until after the Mexican War. What's going on here? Pretty logical things. She applies for statehood. She will obviously come in as a slave state because 10% of the population of Texas at the time was slave under the title indentured servants, and the northern states went ballistic. We are not allowing another slave state in. Remember the problems with Missouri, particularly such a big state that at some point in the future could easily be broken up into 3, 4, or 5 new slave states. So there is total resistance from northern congressmen. As a result, Texas basically had to wait for 10 years. This is why we have the Lone Star State. And this is an independent country with its own foreign relations and its own government and its own president. And first president of Texas, of course, is Sam Houston. And for 10 years. Okay, so what happens after that point? We are the Lone Star Nation. And until July 4th, oddly enough, 1845, symbolically, Europeans recognized Texas as an independent country, but not Mexico, obviously, or the United States. 1840, there are 30,000 Anglos, including 7,000 Germans. In Texas, there are 5,000 slaves, and there are 3,500 Mexicans, and of course, thousands of Native Americans, but they don't count. When Texas got its independence, Texas claimed that the Rio Grande River was the western boundary, including parts of New Mexico, because if you follow the Rio Grande River north, it includes everything on the east side of the Rio Grande, which is a good chunk of New Mexico. When Texas citizens voted whether to apply for annexation or not, the vote was 3,500 for and 91 against annexation. So clearly they wanted to be annexed. The other question involved is a constitutional one. Can the United States accept or annex an independent country? Because Texas was an independent country. We settled the land problem with Louisiana, but this was a different legal problem. Texas was already a self-sustaining independent country. The other problem, of course, is if America does annex Texas, Mexico said, we will immediately declare war on the United States. But finally, we have to do something, because the whole time, who's watching this? European countries, particularly Britain. If the United States does not accept Texas, maybe Britain will and get a foothold in North America again. Polk finally offers, President Polk, James K. Polk, in 1945, and Texas immediately accepts annexation. She knows, and America knows, this is war. Mexico has promised that. But, and I'm quoting Polk, Texas has been absorbed into the Union in the inevitable fulfillment of the general law which is rolling our population westward. Its incorporation into the Union was not only inevitable, but the most natural, right, and proper thing in the world. California will probably follow next in the natural flow of events. Okay, this is manifest destiny. It is America's destiny to stretch to the stretch to the Pacific. Sorry about that. We are a unique state, Texas. We were an independent country. This is one reason, we still have effects of this today, of course, that when Texas joined the Union, unlike the rest of the states, she kept her public lands as state lands. Every place else, they were national lands. As a result, today we have very little federal land in Texas. Other than Big Bend, we don't have a lot of parks, we don't have a lot of forests, we have state parks. Which were donated land by people. We don't have a lot of federal land in Texas. Okay, so neither side, Texas or Mexico or the United States, is going to back off of this. Texas said our border is at the Rio Grande. Mexico said, no, it isn't. It's at the Nueces. There are no settlers down there. President Polk actually offered to cancel the Mexican debt of private citizens to the United States. We don't know how much that was, $5 or $6 million, in exchange for the Rio Grande border, and we could buy more territory if we wanted to. Mexico turned this down without even considering it. So we have Mexico saying the Nueces, Texas saying the Rio Grande. If you go into that area in between those two rivers, this is one of the most desolate parts of the country. It is scrub. It is still today only used basically for grazing cattle, and not very good grazing land as well. Okay. Why don't we know much about the Mexican War? For one thing, the Civil War starts 13 years later, and that overshadows everything. It is a direct contributor to the Civil War, of course. It is, without question, a war of aggression. Abraham Lincoln was totally against the Mexican War. He demanded evidence. He was in Congress, a young congressman. General Grant, Union commander during the Civil War, who knew a thing or two about war, called the Mexican War, and I'm quoting, one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. So this is clearly, and most people knew it at the time, why are we at war with Mexico? Because we can. We can take it. The other factor here is a very sketchy start to the war. Polk has already sent 2,000 U.S. Army troops down to the Rio Grande River to enforce Texas's claims to the Rio Grande. This is before the war starts in June of 1945. And General Zachary Taylor, is ordered to take his 2,000 troops. Mexico gives him an ultimatum: withdraw. Zachary Taylor ignores the ultimatum, and he orders American ships to block the mouth of the Rio Grande, which means he's cutting off Mexican trade as well as Texas trade. Mexican troops also sent to the border, so you have two different countries sending troops to the same desolate area. The Mexicans cross the Rio Grande, trying to get above Taylor and cut him off. Taylor sent a small platoon of 63 guys to intercept the Mexican forces and case out what they were doing. The Mexicans surrounded them, attacked them. 16 Americans were killed, and the rest became prisoners of war. They were captured. Zachary Taylor immediately emails President Polk, and the email, the cable was, hostilities have commenced. The shots have been fired, American blood has been spilled. Polk goes very quickly to Congress and asks for a declaration of war against Mexico. In his speech to Congress, I'm quoting from his speech, "Mexico has shed American blood on American soil. War exists by the act of Mexico itself," unquote. Okay, so the question there is, true or false? American blood definitely was spilled. On American soil, this is contested ground. Mexico and the United States claimed it. But the vote in Congress was overwhelmingly 90-some% to declare war. So we are now at war with Mexico. The minute war is declared, something like 6,000 Texans volunteered to fight with the American troops. These are militia. They are citizen soldiers. They were not regular army. And Zachary Taylor said, those Texas troops are the damnedest in the world. We can't do without them in a fight, and we can't do anything with them out of a fight. So you have two different forces here, which becomes an issue later on. Okay, let me get my other thing here. There was no particular plan of attack. We put it together as we went along. You can look at the map and see the different campaigns. I also have a slide with the 3 different campaigns in the Mexican War. Polk's basic strategy is occupy northern part of Mexico and try and pressure Mexico to bargain to get what he wanted. And what he had his eye on, of course, was California. Texas is already in American hands. Okay, Mexico had no real battle plan except to defend her territory. She had 4 times the size of the American army, and she was fighting on home ground. She should have had some advantages. The U.S. troops originally are only the 2,000 that Zach Taylor had and about 1,500 volunteers. They weren't even organized as militia. They are just Texas volunteers. We didn't want to put them into the U.S. Army because if they're volunteers, there were no restrictions on where they could go. And Zach Taylor's regular troops had to follow presidential orders. Okay. The other background factor is that the American Army, the American military, had much better equipment. Our cannon had twice the range of the Mexican cannon. The Mexican officers had been well trained by the French army, but the Mexican army was made up of largely draftees. You are talking peasant farmers who weren't particularly interested in a war at all and had very little training. We also had much better rifles, much longer range, much more reliable. The Mexican army was still using largely muskets instead of rifles. General Grant had a great phrase on this. He was a young officer during the Mexican War. A Mexican could fire you all day without you finding it out. So they just didn't have the range, and that became a huge factor in a war. So the 3 campaigns in northern Mexico, hang on, I'll go back to this. Yeah, okay. In northern Mexico, Zach Taylor quickly sweeps across northern Mexico. There are some pitched battles in the town of Monterrey and a few others, but pretty soon he occupies northern Mexico. Then the U.S. Army did something that was pretty unique and new to it. It organized an amphibious landing, a sea landing, at several places along the Mexican coast, and particularly at Veracruz. And then from Veracruz, Winfield Scott, our American general, name is not important, had about 8,500 men, which was less than half of what Santa Anna had. He designed special ships, literally landing craft, to get his men there, and took the town of Veracruz with much fewer casualties than the Mexican army had. The American military was very honorable in most of its encounters here. We paid for all the supplies that we took, and many of the officers even went to Catholic Mass in the Catholic cathedrals in the towns they occupied to show their goodwill towards the Mexican people. So from Veracruz, he marches overland to Mexico City. There is a knockdown, drag-out fight from Mexico City that lasts a long time, a series of battles. Mexico City was well fortified. It had fortresses on several of the different entrances, and eventually the Americans took it with very high Mexican casualties and much lower American casualties. Grant is an interesting character here. We talk a lot about him later in the Civil War. When he got to one of the fortresses in Mexico City, he saw that his soldiers couldn't make any progress because the Mexicans had the high ground and they were shooting everything that moved. So he saw a church bell tower nearby. He disassembled a cannon, got some guys, disassembled a cannon, hauled it up to the top of the church bell tower, put it back together again, and from that high point began artillery barrages on the Mexican forces and was able to push them back so our troops could advance. So we finally occupied Mexico City. So we occupy northern Mexico, we occupy Mexico City. And the question becomes, of course, now what? If you occupy Mexico City, have you conquered Mexico? You have conquered Mexico City. They stay there month after month. Soldiers get really restless, very hard to keep them in control. And the biggest problem, of course, was Mexico City had, in the summertime, a fairly tropical climate, and people start dying right and left of malaria. The question is, how long can you stay in Mexico City? There were no Mexican government officials who were willing to sign over Mexico to the United States. They all left town. So there's nobody to sign a treaty with, literally nobody to sign a treaty. Nicholas Trist, our diplomat, disobeyed orders. He stayed when he was ordered home. Americans had given up, but he stayed. He is the guy who married a granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, incidentally, by the way. And he stays, and he finally gets somebody there to sign a treaty. But although we occupied northern Mexico, although we occupied Mexico City and that area, the real crucial actions happen in the West. And you can see those Western campaigns on the map. From Missouri, from St. Louis, Missouri, a small group under an American military commander, Stephen Watts Kearny, also not important, took about 1,000 Westerners. These are militia. They have no professional military training. They are mainly frontiersmen. And he marches, supposedly in a surprise attack, but it was pretty much a surprise attack, and he takes Santa Fe with almost no resistance. There were Mexican troops in Santa Fe, and they pretty much gave the city to Kearny. There were no casualties on either side in that particular encounter. Kearny leaves some of his men there, and he takes about 2/3 of them across, on foot, across the rest of New Mexico, the rest of Arizona, and Southern California, and attacks the Presidio, the fortress city of San Diego, where there was a military presence. San Diego falls to the Americans. They walked about 800 miles. If it had been summer, they never would have made it. Fortunately, it was wintertime, and they could make it. So from San Diego, Kearny begins to move his troops north, Presidio by Presidio, Mexican City by small Mexican City, and they take each one with very low casualties and very little resistance. There weren't a whole lot of Mexican troops in these different towns along the way. So he moves up the coast. As he moves up the coast, American naval ships offshore land troops at the major center, the major Mexican-Spanish center of Monterey, where there was a fairly large presidio. So by the time Kearny gets his men up to Monterey, we have American sailors from American ships also landing. We also had an odd little detail, about 500 Mormons who had walked on a separate route overland and joined the American forces. When the war broke out, a Mormon leader went to the United States military and said, you're looking for troops. We can get together 500 young Mormon guys if you pay us a regular military salary. The settlers in Salt Lake were absolutely starved of resources. They had no income, they had no cash, and this was a way for the Mormons to raise money. And the U.S. Army accepted them, and this became the Mormon Battalion. So you have 500 young Mormons also out there. The Presidio of Monterey fell, and above the Presidio of Monterey, the Americans raised the bear flag. This is called the Bear Flag Revolt. The state flag of California has a bear on it. And if you look at that bear, I have a thing with bears, so I'm getting off on a tangent here. If you look at that bear, that is clearly a grizzly bear, which was pretty funny because there were no grizzlies left in California. By this time, they had all been killed off. Difference between a grizzly bear and a black bear. Grizzly bear has a hump on the shoulder. Black bear is pretty flat. Grizzly bear has a dished face. In other words, there's two planes on the face. A black bear has a cone face. Grizzly bears are usually brownish, but some black bears are also brown, so you can't use the color. Usually larger, but not always. But the hump and the dished face you can see from half a mile away. So if you ever see one of those, get out. Black bears will leave you alone. Grizzly bears are apex predators. They will eat you. They eat black bears too, so they're not afraid of people. Anyway, so the Bear Flag Revolt. We now occupied California. Why? Because there's very few Hispanics in California. There were isolated ranches, far spread apart. There were small presidios. There may be a grand total of 3,000 to 4,000 Hispanics in California when this war broke out. So it's no big surprise that California fell so quickly. There were even a good number of Anglos and Europeans in California. The entire population, this is kind of funny to think of now, of Los Angeles was about 1,500 people. Mexico had ignored California just like she ignored Texas. It was thousands of miles away from Mexico City. She had pretty much left them alone. So now we occupied all of it. When the treaty was finally signed, after 6 months of occupying Mexico City, Mexico gives up her territory. And again, if you go to that first slide in this file, you can see what she gave up. All are part of 7 states. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed in 1849. We get the Rio Grande as the Texas border. We got what we wanted. Texas agreed in the treaty to give up its claims to New Mexico in exchange for the United States paying off the debts of the Texas War of Independence. So New Mexico got its territory back. Mexico was paid in the treaty $15 million for California and $3.2 million for New Mexico, and the United States government assumed the debts of Mexican citizens and companies. So we also had some war debts to pay off. Why did we bother paying Mexico if we occupied and owned the territory? Possession is 9/10 of the law. My theory is, and along with many other people, to make it look legitimate, because this was clearly a war of aggression. Why did we take this territory? Because we could. And Mexico was pretty helpless to resist us. But the money made it look like a legitimate war. Other things we got from the war, we got war experience. When the Civil War breaks out 13 years later, the Mexican War is the only military experience most of our commanders have. Crucial people involved. Grant, of course, was an officer in the Mexican War, and Robert E. Lee was the head of the engineering corps in the Mexican War and gained very valuable experience. Almost every single one of our generals also had fought in the Mexican War. We had altogether, all the Americans who fought, almost every single one of them a Southerner, 31,000 in the regular army. We lost very few casualties, maybe over 1,000 in battle deaths, not very many, but we lost another 6,000 casualties to disease, things like malaria and dysentery. So this is one reason we don't hear about the Mexican War so much. Militarily, it is a huge success, and you'd think we'd hear more about it. But we had very high casualties, 20% casualties, not from battle, but from poor sanitation and from disease. The other reasons, of course, we don't hear about the Mexican War is it's really sketchy. How did we get into this? It's not a clear-cut thing. Who owned the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was contested at the time. We went into it, so did Mexico. The other reason, most in the North opposed the war. Almost every Northerner was against the war. It was very clear this was going to add land to the southern slaveholding states. So the country is very split about it. Another sideline about this is the Texas Volunteers, who traveled into Mexico with Zachary Scott's army along the border. And this is something we don't hear very much about, and I've seen in a number of sources. But they did not behave well. You have to remember 10 years earlier, they had fought Mexican army. They had lost brothers, sons, civilians as well, brutality on both sides. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, and they were out for blood. There's no way around it. When the Texas Volunteers got into Mexico, they burned, they raped, they pillaged, they stole, they murdered. Until finally Zachary Scott gathered them together, marched them back to the Rio Grande, crossed them over on the other side, and said, if I see any of you cross this river again, I will have you shot on sight. So they were not very well behaved. This is not the regular Mexican army. This is the Texas Volunteers, who were pretty much on their own, and nobody had too much control over them. Another reason we don't hear about the Mexican War and direct repercussions today is basic old-fashioned racism. Again, you have the issue of adding Texas to southern slave states. But when we occupied Mexico City, when we occupied northern Mexico, many Southerners in Congress and in newspapers around the South began to argue, let's just keep it. We own it. Let's just keep it. There's good land in Mexico. In fact, you had many Southerners arguing, not only let's keep Mexico, let's keep going. Let's go all the way to Panama. We could have. There was no military force to stop us once the Mexican army is defeated. John C. Calhoun, our good senator friend from South Carolina, while this debate is going on in Congress, finally stands up and says, and I am quoting here, Mexico has 7 million Indians, Mexicans, who are bigoted. They're bigoted. What religion is Mexico? Catholic. But in American eyes, they're bigoted. Ignorant, idle, lawless, slavish, and yet free. They are worse than slaves because Mexico had no slavery. Let me read that again. Mexico has 7 million Indians who are bigoted, ignorant, idle, lawless, slavish, and yet free. And when he said that, the discussion shifted and people became aware, okay, we don't want a place with 7 million more slavish-like people. We have enough of those. And so the talk about annexing Mexico and making it part of the United States died down very quickly, to which Mexico says, thank goodness. So Mexican War has long-term effects on Mexican-American relations even today. This is a touchy relationship between Mexico and the United States. Why? We took about 40% of Mexico. Why did we take it? Because we could. Another little interesting fact, when California was taken in 1949, when the treaty was signed, 2 weeks before the treaty was signed with Mexico, ceding all of that territory, a miller setting up a mill dam in the Sacramento Valley looked down into the stream and saw little bits of gold. John Sutter started to pan for gold, and the word got out slowly in the beginning, but this is one of the first gold strikes in the American West. This is the 49ers.